As Kofi returned home, what he expected to be a joyous reunion quickly twisted into a nightmare. The vibrant village he once knew had become a wasteland, its huts scorched, and the familiar sounds of laughter replaced by the desperate cries of people clashing in the streets. His heart pounded, but the worst part wasn't the destruction. It was the absence of his wife, Fifi. He searched frantically through the chaos, but found no trace of her. Then, out of the dust and turmoil, a young man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, and sharp-eyed. Kofi blinked in disbelief. It was Kwasi, his son, now 16, almost a man. Kofi's breath caught in his throat, but Kwasi's expression wasn't one of joy or relief. It was of confusion and pain. He stared at Kofi, the father he had only heard stories of, and felt the sting of betrayal run through him like a knife. "You," Kwasi's voice trembled as he spoke. "I don't even know you." Kofi's heart sank. He had feared this moment. Years of absence had taken their toll. He reached out, his voice soft, trying to close the gulf between them. "Kwasi, I'm your father." But Kwasi stood firm, bitterness in his eyes. "I've only heard stories, and none of them explain why you left us." Kofi swallowed hard, unsure of how to reach the boy who once idolized him. "Where's your mother?" Kofi asked, the dread in his heart deepening. Tears filled Kwasi's eyes, and his voice cracked with raw emotion. "They took her, Papa. They beat her. They tore her clothes. I couldn't stop them." His body shook, and tears spilled down his cheeks. "They took Mama." A rare tear slipped from Kofi's own eye. He had faced death 1,000 times on the seas, but this was the deepest wound. He pulled Kwasi close, both of them trembling, holding on to each other as the weight of their pain and loss pressed down on them. Kwasi's voice broke through the grief. "We have to get her back, Papa. We have to." Kofi, despite the enormity of the task, nodded. "Yes, son, we will." "When?" Kwasi asked, urgency in his voice. Kofi inhaled deeply, calming his racing thoughts. An African proverb says, "A restless foot may walk into a snake pit." "We will get her back, Kwasi. But first, I want to know my son, and I want you to know me." The next morning, Kofi and Kwasi set off, embarking on a 20-mile trek into the lush jungle. It was a journey not just of miles, but of understanding. As they walked, they spoke of the past, years lost, decisions made. Kofi told his son of the sea, of the years he had survived. 15 years, son, Kofi began as they rested by the fire that night. I held on to the thought of home, even when the waves threatened to claim me, even when hope seemed to slip away. It was you and your mother. You kept me alive. Kwasi listened, but the bitterness in him was not so easily washed away. If you had returned sooner, Mama would still be here. Kofi stared into the flames. His voice was low and heavy. Greed, Kwasi. Greed and power clouded my mind. I became a man consumed by it. I gained wealth, but lost everything that truly mattered. Kwasi remained silent, his emotions torn between understanding and the pain of abandonment. The jungle around them was quiet until dawn, when strange noises stirred them awake. Suddenly, they were surrounded by a group of monkeys, their wild chattering filling the air. Kwasi's heart raced, and he instinctively stepped back, fear gripping him. But Kofi, calm and unshaken, made a series of strange, rhythmic calls. The monkeys paused, and from behind the trees, a great figure emerged. Abawaku, the two-headed monkey, appeared before them, its eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. Kwasi froze, terror overwhelming him. But Kofi placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "Do not fear. This is Abawaku. He helped me survive the darkest days on the sea." But Abawaku did not come with good news. "While you were gone, the Jabari brothers, lions from the east, have begun hunting us. They have developed a taste for monkey flesh." Kwasi's voice trembled as he interjected, "The Jabari brothers, they say they are fearless lions." Kofi's face hardened. Jabari means fearless, yes, but lions don't travel this far west on their own. Something else is driving them. The debt Kofi owed to Abawaku for his survival now came calling. Loyalty, he explained to Kwasi, was everything in their world. Kofi decided to help, and together, they laid a trap for the Jabari lions. Days of planning followed, and when the lions finally came, everything fell into place. The mighty beasts were captured, their reign of terror over the jungle ended. On their journey back, Kofi turned to Kwasi. "It's time you learned something new." They took a small boat out to the shore for a fishing trip, Kwasi eager, never having fished before. As they sat together, waiting for a catch, Kofi turned to his son. "Can you swim?" he asked, seemingly out of nowhere. "No, Papa, I never learned." Without warning, Kofi grabbed Kwasi and hurled him into the water. The boy thrashed and screamed, panic in his every move. "Papa, help!" he cried, the sea swallowing him whole. But before the waves could pull him under, fins broke the surface. The redwater dolphins, Kofi's old companions, glided through the water, rescuing Kwasi and guiding him back to the boat. As Kwasi gasped for breath, shocked and drenched, he stared at his father in awe. You control dolphins?" Kofi chuckled softly. "No, son, I don't control them. They come because they are loyal, just as Abawaku is, and just as they have saved you, they will help us save your mother." For the next 6 months, Kofi trained Kwasi in the ways of the jungle, the sea, and the bond between man and beast. He learned to trust the dolphins and the two-headed monkey. The rescue mission was being prepared, and Kwasi was no longer just a boy. He was becoming a warrior. Meanwhile, aboard the Ghost Bandit, the pirate ship Kofi once commanded, new leadership had taken hold. Captain John Bloodhound ruled with iron and terror, having murdered the previous captain in cold blood. Kofi knew that to reclaim what was his, he would need to buy Bloodhound's help with gold. When Kofi and Kwasi arrived with their trusted crew, Abawaku, and the redwater dolphins, the pirates cheered, chanting, "Blackspear, Blackspear." But in the shadows, Bloodhound watched with one eye open, plotting. That night, Kwasi asked, "Why does Bloodhound sleep with one eye open?" Kofi smiled darkly. "A man who leads through fear can never truly sleep. Remember, Kwasi, your enemies will be different. You won't sleep beside them, but you must always be ready." With Bloodhound lurking, Kofi knew time was short. A trap was carefully laid for Captain Bloodhound, but the clever pirate didn't fall for it. Instead, he shifted his attention to Kofi's son, Kwasi, sensing an easier target. However, it didn't take long for Bloodhound to realize that Kwasi, though young, was every bit as sharp and ruthless as his father. The boy's cunning and cold resolve matched his father's, turning what Bloodhound had thought would be an easy conquest into a deadly game. With Bloodhound dead, Kofi's journey continued, But there was no time to rest. He gathered his crew and told them their next stop was Haiti, where they would meet an old ally, the witch doctor who had helped him in the past. Kofi hoped the man could guide him to find his wife, Fifi. When they arrived in Haiti, Kofi got an unpleasant surprise. The witch doctor had been thrown in jail for selling stolen goods. His reputation was ruined, and his work had stopped. Kofi had changed his look by shaving off his dreadlocks, so the witch doctor didn't recognize him at first. But once he did, he agreed to help, on one condition. Kofi had to break him out of jail. This wasn't the first time Kofi had to pay his way out of trouble. He bribed the jail clerk to free the witch doctor. Once out, the witch doctor used his magic to find where Fifi was. She wasn't in Haiti, as Kofi had hoped. She was far away in England, enslaved at a place called the Lewis Estate. Kofi's anger grew at the thought of Fifi being in chains, and he promised himself he would bring her back. After days of surveillance in England, Kofi's plan was set. Kofi crept through the estate grounds under the cover of darkness. The estate was massive, its fields sprawling out like an endless maze. Kofi had spent years on the sea, but nothing could prepare him for the sight of his beloved Fifi, working alone in the cold moonlight, her hands rough from labor. She moved slowly, with the weariness of someone who had long since given up hope. Kofi approached her quietly, whispering her name. Fifi, Fifi. She froze, her body tense, before turning around. Her eyes widened as her basket slipped from her hands, the fruits and vegetables tumbling to the ground. Kofi, she breathed, her voice cracking with disbelief. You're alive. Kofi stepped closer, his heart racing. Yes, Fifi, I told you I would come back for you. Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to comprehend the sight before her. You came back. She reached out for him, touching his face as if to confirm he was real. We don't have much time, Kofi urged, his voice low but firm. We have to go now. But Fifi didn't move. Her face darkened with sorrow, and she shook her head. I can't leave, Kofi, not without my son. Kofi felt a chill run down his spine. Fifi, he said slowly, Kwasi is on the ship. We will go together, now. No, Fifi whispered, shaking her head again. Not Kwasi, my other son. As if on cue, a small boy came running toward them from the nearby cottage, calling out, Mama! Mama! Kofi's chest tightened. The boy, Fifi's son, but not his. We cannot take him, Kofi said, his voice trembling with a mix of frustration and fear. There's no time. We'll come back for him later, but now we must go. Fifi's face hardened with resolve. Do you think I wanted this, Kofi? Do you think I wanted to be raped? Her voice broke, and tears rolled down her cheeks. But he is my son, and I will not leave him behind. If you love me, you'll take him with us. Kofi was about to respond when the sound of footsteps interrupted them. A tall, older gentleman approached, his posture reeking of entitlement and arrogance. What's this? The man sneered, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Kofi. Who are you, boy? A runaway, perhaps? Kofi remained silent, his head lowered. The man stepped closer, his voice sharp with authority. Do you want 20 lashes, boy? Speak when I address you. Kofi slowly lifted his head, meeting the man's gaze. Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. Blackspear, he whispered in shock. Your Blackspear. Before the man could shout for help, Kofi's knife was in his hand. In one swift motion, he slit the man's throat, silencing him forever. The small boy screamed, "Papa! Papa!" as he clung to Fifi's leg, tears streaming down his face. Fifi looked at Kofi, her eyes wide with horror. "What have you done?" "I did what I had to," Kofi growled, his voice cold. "You said you didn't ask to be raped, and I don't want to be hanged by morning. We leave now." Fifi's expression hardened, but she said nothing more. She scooped up the crying child, holding him close as they hurried toward the perimeter of the estate, where Kwasi was waiting. The ghost bandit cut through the dark waters of the Atlantic as they sailed away from England. Kofi stood at the helm, staring out into the horizon. Kwasi and Fifi sat together on deck, the small boy huddled in his mother's arms. The tension between them was thick, but there was no turning back now.